Christmas Eve should have been sacred, but Linda Carter stood at her desk, tears streaming down her face, begging for mercy that would never come. Mr. Cross had made his decision with the coldness of a man who had forgotten what it meant to love. Her son, Daniel, lay in a hospital bed 10 miles away, his small body fighting a battle he was losing. She stayed because she had no choice, because rent and medical bills don't pause for grief. Hours later, Cross would stand in that same hospital, watching Linda hold her son's hand as his heartbeat faded into silence. Subscribed to witness the moment a man's soul shattered under the weight of a choice that could never be undone. The fluorescent lights in the office hummed with a sterile persistence that made Linda Carter's temples throb as she stared at the computer screen, her vision blurring from exhaustion and unshed tears. Christmas Eve in Atlanta should have meant warmth, carols drifting through neighborhoods, the smell of cinnamon and pine, but here, in this glass tower that scraped the winter sky, it meant nothing more than another deadline, another demand, another reminder that her life belonged to someone else. She had arrived at 6 that morning, her hands trembling as she swiped her badge, knowing that somewhere across the city, Daniel was waking up in a hospital bed that smelled of antiseptic and fear, his small fingers reaching for a mother who wasn't there. The guilt sat heavy in her chest, a stone she carried everywhere, growing heavier with each passing hour. Mr. Cross had arrived at 9, his expensive shoes clicking against the marble floor with the rhythm of a man who had never questioned his right to take up space, to demand, to control. He barely glanced at her as he passed, his coat still dusted with snow, his face set in the permanent scowl of someone who measured human worth in productivity reports and profit margins. Linda had watched him disappear into his office, the door closing with a finality that made her stomach clench, and she had tried to focus on the spreadsheet in front of her, tried to ignore the way her phone sat silent on the desk, the screen dark because she had turned off notifications so she wouldn't see the messages from the nurses, wouldn't see the updates that told her Daniel's fever was climbing, that his breathing was becoming labored, that time was running out. She told herself she would finish this one task, just this one, and then she would ask again, would plead if she had to, because surely even Cross had a heart somewhere beneath that expensive suit. At 11, she had knocked on his door, her knuckles rapping softly against the wood, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs. He had looked up from his desk with the kind of irritation reserved for interruptions he deemed unnecessary, his eyes cold and flat. And she had forced herself to speak, to explain that Daniel was in the hospital, that the doctors had said it could be any day now, that she just needed a few hours, just enough time to hold her son's hand and tell him she loved him before it was too late. Cross had leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, and for a moment she had dared to hope, had allowed herself to believe that he might understand, that somewhere in the mechanism of his carefully constructed indifference there was a sliver of humanity. But then he had spoken, his voice flat and dismissive, telling her that the company didn't pay her to manage personal crises, that if she left there would be consequences, that there were plenty of people who would be grateful for her position. She had stood there, frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water, unable to comprehend the cruelty of his words, the way they sliced through her like glass. She wanted to scream, to overturn his desk, to make him see that her son was dying, that Daniel was not a line item or a scheduling conflict, that he was a 10-year-old boy who loved dinosaurs and asked questions about the stars and still reached for her hand when he was scared. But she couldn't, because she needed this job, needed the insurance that kept Daniel in that hospital bed instead of at home where she couldn't afford the medications, couldn't afford the machines that beeped and hissed and kept his fragile body tethered to life. So she had nodded, her throat tight with the kind of grief that has no outlet, and she had returned to her desk, her hands shaking so badly she could barely type. The hours stretched on with the cruel slowness of torture, each minute a knife twisting deeper into her chest as she imagined Daniel alone, his eyes searching the doorway for a mother who wasn't coming, his small voice asking the nurses when she would be there, when she would hold him, when he could go home. She had called during her lunch break, her voice breaking as she spoke to the nurse, asking if he was okay, if he was scared, if he was asking for her, and the nurse had been kind but honest, telling her that Daniel was struggling, that his condition was deteriorating, that she should come as soon as she could. Linda had hung up the phone and pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the break room window, watching the snow fall in soft, mocking flurries, knowing that somewhere in this city her sun was fading and she was trapped here, chained to a desk by fear and powerlessness. She had returned to her cubicle, her eyes dry because the tears had run out, leaving only a hollow ache that filled every corner of her body. As the afternoon light began to fade and the office slowly emptied, Linda sat alone in the dim glow of her monitor, listening to the hum of the building's ventilation system and the distant sound of someone laughing in another department, a sound so incongruous it felt like an insult. She thought about Daniel's birth, how she had held him for the first time and promised she would always protect him, would always be there, would never let him feel alone or afraid. And she wondered how she had ended up here, breaking that promise in the cruelest way possible. She wondered if he would forgive her, if in those final moments he would understand that she had stayed, not because she didn't love him, but because the world was constructed in such a way that love was not enough, that survival demanded sacrifices that shredded the soul. She closed her eyes and whispered an apology into the empty office, knowing it would never reach him, knowing that some wounds could never be healed. Mr. Cross sat in his office as the winter sun bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the mahogany desk that had cost more than Linda's annual salary. And he felt a satisfaction that came from control, from knowing that his company ran like clockwork because he refused to tolerate weakness or sentimentality. He had built this empire from the ground up, had clawed his way through corporate hierarchies with a ruthlessness that left no room for doubt or compassion, and he told himself that this was the price of success, that empathy was a luxury reserved for those who didn't understand the stakes. His phone sat silent on the desk, sleek and black, a tool he wielded with precision, and he glanced at it occasionally, checking emails, responding to messages from clients and investors, people who mattered, people whose time was worth his attention. He thought briefly of Linda, of the way she had stood in his office earlier, her face pale and desperate, and he dismissed the memory with a shrug, reminding himself that personal problems were not his concern. The call came at 6:15, just as he was preparing to leave, his coat already draped over one arm, his mind already shifting to the dinner reservation he had made at a restaurant where they knew his name and his preferences. The phone vibrated against the desk, the screen lighting up with a number he recognized immediately, his mother's assisted living facility, and he felt a flicker of annoyance because he had just spoken to her 2 days ago, had assured her he would visit after the holidays, had done his duty as a son in the efficient, detached way he did everything. He answered with a curt greeting, expecting to hear the manager's voice updating him on some trivial matter, a change in medication, or a request for additional funds, but instead there was panic, urgency, the kind of breathless fear that cuts through routine and demands attention. They told him his mother had collapsed, that she had been rushed to the hospital, that he needed to come immediately, and for the first time in years, Cross felt the ground shift beneath him. He drove through the city with a recklessness that was foreign to him. running red lights and weaving through traffic as the snow fell harder, coating the windshield in a white veil that his wipers struggled to clear. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles went white, and he realized with a strange, disorienting clarity that he was afraid, genuinely afraid, in a way he hadn't been since he was a child. He thought of his mother, of her frail body in a hospital bed, and he felt a surge of something he couldn't name, something that felt like grief mixed with rage, as if the universe had betrayed him by reminding him that even he was not immune to loss. He had spent decades building walls around himself, constructing a life where emotions were liabilities and vulnerability was a weakness, and now those walls were crumbling, leaving him exposed and raw in a way that felt unbearable. The hospital loomed ahead, a sprawling complex of glass and concrete that glowed against the night sky, and Cross parked haphazardly, barely remembering to turn off the engine before he was running through the automatic doors, his breath coming in sharp gasps as he demanded directions to the cardiac unit. The nurse at the desk looked at him with a mixture of pity and professionalism, giving him a room number and pointing him toward the elevators, and he moved through the corridors in a daze, his mind struggling to reconcile the sterile reality of this place with the abstract concept of his mother's mortality. He had always thought of her as permanent, as a fixture in his life that required maintenance but would never truly disappear, and the possibility that she might die, that he might lose her, felt like a violation of the natural order. He found her room and pushed through the door, his eyes immediately finding her small form beneath the white sheets, her face pale and sunken, her breathing assisted by machines that beeped and hissed with a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. Cross stood frozen in the doorway, his expensive coat hanging forgotten from his arm, and he felt something inside him crack, a fissure that ran deep and threatened to split him open. He approached the bed slowly, his hand reaching out to touch hers, and he was startled by how fragile she felt. How the woman who had raised him, who had worked double shifts to put him through school, who had sacrificed everything so he could have opportunities she never dreamed of, had become this delicate, breakable thing. He wanted to say something, to tell her he was sorry for all the missed visits, for all the times he had prioritized work over her, but the words stuck in his throat, heavy and useless. As he stood there, his vision blurred by tears he didn't know he was capable of shedding, a nurse entered the room, her scrubs decorated with cartoon snowflakes, and she asked if he needed anything, her voice gentle and practiced. Cross shook his head, unable to speak, and the nurse paused, her expression softening as she said something about the pediatric ward being just down the hall, about how hard the holidays were for families with sick children, about a mother who had been there all day with her son who was in critical condition. The words washed over Cross like cold water, and he felt a strange compulsion, a need to move, to escape the suffocating weight of his own emotions. And he found himself walking out of the room, down the hallway, following the signs to the pediatric unit as if pulled by an invisible thread. He didn't know why he was going, didn't understand the impulse, but he couldn't stop himself, couldn't turn back. And when he reached the doorway of the room at the end of the hall, he looked inside, and his entire world collapsed. Linda sat beside Daniel's bed, her hand wrapped around his small fingers, and she felt the world narrow to this single moment, this fragile connection between mother and son that was slipping away with each shallow breath he took. The machines surrounding them beeped with a persistent rhythm that had become the soundtrack of her nightmare, and she leaned close, whispering words she hoped he could hear, promises that everything would be okay, even though she knew it was a lie, even though the doctors had told her there was nothing more they could do. Daniel's face was pale, almost translucent in the harsh fluorescent light, his eyes closed but fluttering occasionally, as if he were trying to wake from a dream he couldn't escape. She stroked his hair, the soft brown strands that smelled faintly of hospital soap, and she thought about all the moments she had missed, all the times she had chosen work over bedtime stories, all the school plays and soccer games she had sacrificed to keep them afloat. And she wondered if he knew, if he understood that every choice had been an act of love wrapped in desperation. She had arrived at the hospital just after 7, her hands still cramping from hours of typing, her eyes swollen from crying in the parking lot where no one could see her break apart. The nurses had greeted her with the kind of sympathy that made her stomach turn, because it meant they knew, they understood that this was the end, that she was here not to visit, but to say goodbye. They had told her that Daniel's condition had worsened rapidly in the afternoon, that his fever had spiked and his organs were beginning to fail, that she should prepare herself, as if there was any way to prepare for the obliteration of your entire universe. She had nodded mechanically, moving through the motions of sitting down, of taking his hand, of becoming the mother she should have been hours ago, and she hated herself with a ferocity that felt like it might consume her from the inside out. Daniel stirred slightly, his lips parting as he tried to speak, and Linda leaned closer, her ear inches from his mouth, desperate to catch whatever words he might offer, whatever final gift he might leave her. His voice was barely a whisper, a fragile thread of sound that she had to strain to hear, and he asked if she was there, if she had come, if she was going to stay, and she felt her heart shatter into pieces so small they could never be put back together. She told him yes, she was here. She wasn't going anywhere. She would stay with him forever, and she saw the corner of his mouth lift in the faintest smile, a small gesture that meant he believed her, that he trusted her even though she had failed him in the most fundamental way. She pressed her lips to his forehead, tasting the salt of his sweat mixed with her tears, and she prayed to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore, begging for just a little more time, just a few more minutes to memorize the feel of his hand, the sound of his breathing, the weight of his presence in the world. The door to the room opened, and Linda barely registered it, her entire focus locked on Daniel, on the way his chest rose and fell with increasing difficulty, on the way his grip on her hand was weakening. She heard footsteps, sensed someone standing in the doorway, but she didn't look up because nothing else mattered. Nothing else existed beyond this bed, this moment, this child who was slipping away from her. The machines began to change their rhythm, the beeps coming faster and then slower, erratic and panicked, and a nurse rushed in, her movements quick and efficient, checking monitors and adjusting tubes, and Linda knew, without being told, that this was it, that the end had arrived, that the universe was about to take from her the only thing that had ever mattered. She held Daniel tighter, whispering, "I love you," over and over like a mantra, like a spell that might keep him anchored to this world, and she felt his hand go limp in hers, felt the last breath leave his body with a softness that seemed impossibly cruel. Time stopped, or maybe it shattered, fracturing into shards that cut her everywhere, and Linda heard a sound that didn't seem to come from her own body. A wail of grief, so raw and primal, it echoed through the hallway and into the souls of everyone who heard it. She collapsed over Daniel's chest, her arms wrapping around him as if she could hold death at bay through sheer force of will. And she felt the nurse's hand on her shoulder, gentle but firm, trying to guide her away, trying to tell her something she couldn't hear because the roar in her ears was too loud, the pain too absolute. She refused to let go, refused to accept that he was gone, that his small body was now just a shell, that the boy who had called her Mama and drawn her pictures and asked her why the sky was blue was no longer there, had been taken from her while she sat at a desk typing reports that would be forgotten by morning. In the doorway, Mr. Cross stood paralyzed, his face drained of all color, his eyes locked on the scene before him with a horror that transcended comprehension. He recognized Linda immediately, the woman who had begged him for mercy just hours ago, and he saw the truth of what he had done, the direct line between his refusal and this moment, this irreversible devastation. He had thought himself powerful, had believed that control and dominance were the markers of success. But standing here, watching a mother break under the weight of loss he had contributed to, he understood with brutal clarity that he was not powerful at all, that he was small and petty and cruel, that he had destroyed something sacred for the sake of a deadline that meant nothing, for the sake of an ego that demanded obedience over humanity. He wanted to run, to escape this room and this moment and this unbearable knowledge. But his legs wouldn't move, his body refused to obey, and he stood there, a witness to his own monstrosity, unable to look away from the consequences of his choices. Cross didn't remember leaving the hospital, didn't recall the drive back to his empty penthouse apartment where the marble floors reflected his image like a stranger he no longer recognized. He sat in the dark, still wearing his coat, his hands trembling as he stared at nothing, his mind replaying the scene in that hospital room over and over like a film reel he couldn't stop, couldn't escape. He saw Linda's face, the way it had contorted in agony, the sound of her grief echoing in his skull with a persistence that made him want to claw his way out of his own skin. He had spent his entire life building a fortress of success, convincing himself that ruthlessness was strength, that empathy was weakness, that the only thing that mattered was winning, and in a single moment, all of it had collapsed, revealing the rotting foundation beneath. He understood now that he had become a monster, not through deliberate cruelty, but through indifference, through the slow erosion of his humanity in service to ambition and control. He thought about his mother, still lying in that hospital bed, her condition stabilized, but her future uncertain, and he felt a shame so deep it threatened to swallow him whole. He had nearly lost her, had been given a glimpse of what it would feel like to have her ripped away, and yet when Linda had come to him with the same fear, the same desperation, he had dismissed her, had valued a spreadsheet over a child's life. The hypocrisy was unbearable, the realization that he had demanded empathy for himself while denying it to others. And he wondered if this was karma, if the universe was forcing him to confront the man he had become by holding up a mirror he couldn't look away from. He poured himself a drink, then another, the alcohol burning his throat but doing nothing to numb the pain, doing nothing to erase the image of Daniel's small body, or the sound of Linda's wails, or the knowledge that he was responsible, that his choices had consequences that extended far beyond quarterly reports and profit margins. The days that followed passed in a haze of self-loathing and paralysis, Cross going through the motions of his life without inhabiting it, his mind trapped in that hospital room, in the moment he had looked into Linda's eyes and seen the hatred there, the raw, justified fury of a woman who had every right to wish him obliterated. He didn't go back to the office, couldn't bring himself to walk through those doors and sit at that desk and pretend that anything mattered, that any of it had been worth the price. His assistant called repeatedly, his phone buzzing with messages from colleagues and clients, people demanding his attention, his decisions, his presence, and he ignored them all, letting the calls go to voicemail, letting the business he had built begin to crumble without him. He didn't care, couldn't care, because what was the point of an empire built on the broken backs of people like Linda, on the sacrifices of those who had no choice but to obey or starve? He wrote the resignation letter on a Tuesday, his hand steady for the first time in days, the words simple and final. He didn't offer explanations or justifications, didn't try to soften the blow or preserve his reputation, because none of it mattered anymore. None of it had ever mattered. He was resigning effective immediately, stepping down from the company he had founded, walking away from everything he had spent his life building, and he felt a strange sense of relief, as if by destroying the monument to his own ego, He might somehow atone for the damage he had caused. He knew it wouldn't bring Daniel back, knew that Linda would carry the weight of this loss for the rest of her life, knew that no amount of self-flagellation would undo what he had done, but he couldn't continue, couldn't pretend to be the man he had been before that night, before he had seen the cost of his cruelty laid bare in the most devastating way possible. He went back to the hospital one last time, not to the pediatric ward, but to his mother's room, and he sat beside her bed and told her everything, the words spilling out in a confession he hadn't known he needed to make. She listened in silence, her frail hand resting on his, and when he finished, when he had emptied himself of all the poison he had carried, she looked at him with eyes that held both disappointment and love, and she told him that redemption was not something you achieved, but something you lived, that he couldn't erase the past, but he could choose differently going forward. Cross nodded, his throat tight, and he understood that she was right, that this was not an ending but a beginning, that he had to find a way to live with what he had done, to carry the weight of it without letting it crush him entirely, to honor Daniel's memory by becoming the kind of man who would never make that choice again. As he walked out of the hospital into the cold December night, the snow falling in soft flurries that melted on his skin, Cross felt the enormity of his guilt settle over him like a shroud, a burden he would carry for the rest of his life. He thought about Linda, wondered where she was, if she was surviving, if she hated him as much as he hated himself, and he knew that he would never approach her, would never ask for forgiveness, because some things were unforgivable, some wounds too deep to heal. He had taken the last moments of a mother with her dying child, had stolen something sacred and irreplaceable, and no resignation, no apology, no amount of regret could change that. He walked through the empty streets, a man stripped of everything he thought defined him, and he wondered if this was what it meant to be human, to feel the full weight of your failures, to understand that power without compassion was not power at all, but a prison that destroyed everyone it touched. He didn't have answers, didn't know how to move forward, but he kept walking, one foot in front of the other, because that was all he could do, all any of them could do, in a world where the consequences of cruelty echoed long after the moment had passed.